Now, our keynote speaker for today is Raymond Antrobus, MBE, who was born in Hackney to an English mother and Jamaican father. In 2019, he became the first ever poet to be awarded the Rathbone Folio Prize for his best work of literature in any genre. Other accolades include the Ted Hughes Award, the PBS Winter Choice, a Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year Award, the Somerset Maugham Award, and the Guardian Poetry Book of the Year in 2018. And in 2019, he became Jamaican. His poem, Jamaican British, was added to the UK's GCSE syllabus. He's a recipient of fellowships from Cave Canem, Complete Works 3, the Jarwood Compton, and the Royal Society of Literature. He's also one of the world's first recipients of an MA in spoken word education from Goldsmiths University. Raymond is an ambassador for the Poetry School and a board member for English Pen, an organization that promotes freedom of expression and literature across frontiers. His poetry has appeared on BBC Two, BBC Radio 4, The Big Issue, the Jamaica Gleaner, The Guardian, and at TEDx East End. Raymond, welcome to the Knowledge Cultures Conference. I'm going to hand it over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks, Bab. Hello, everyone. Good to be here. I just would like to quickly get a picture up of this man called John LaRose. I'm gonna dedicate my section to talk to this man, John LaRose, who was active in Islington and in the Camden Borough. He lived in Islington, but just on the edge of it. And something that he did, and his peers would include poets and writers like Andrew Solkey, publishers like Margaret Busby, James Berry, Jessica and Eric Huntley, Michael Rosen, Darcus Howe. And I just want to kind of hold him up as someone who I look to as not just a inspirational poet, but also an inspirational teacher, who I have kind of, studied in my own way and tried to kind of model some of my own practice as both a teacher and a poet around him. So I'll come back to John LaRose in a second. So I thought that I would just begin by saying that, yes, I'm a poet, but I'm also a teacher, and those two identities they're not binaries, they're not opposites. To me, they are one of the same thing. There's no classroom I go into where I'm not a poet, and there's no stage that I step onto where I'm not also a teacher. And I'll talk a bit more about how I make sense of those two identities in a second as well. So I thought I would just kind of give you some of my own personal background and my own teaching, and actually how I got into poetry. So as I said, I was born in Hackney to a mother who was very kind of politically engaged and curious. And I guess, in fact, the grounding of this whole talk is going to be culture capital, like how wealthy we are in culture capital, and why perhaps I'm not sure if we are utilizing it in the most impactful way. When we're thinking about diversity, but also diversity of learning styles, as well as all the other things that come with that. So yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that growing up, I was not very academically accomplished, but my main privilege is having two parents who were engaged and rich in culture. I very much describe my upbringing as a working class one, and social housing, a mom who worked at the markets, she would make jewelry and she would sell them at Camden Market and at Camden Passage as well. And so markets and festivals and all this kind of thing has been very much a big part of my childhood and my landscape there. But one of the things, and my dad came over from Jamaica, who at times, while I was a kid, he was practicing Rastafarian, but that's also a tricky thing. I don't know how true he was to the Rastafarian religion, but he tried to honor it. And so I learned a lot, I'd say, about the Jamaican and the British histories and where they entwine through him. But what I do want to talk about is education, where it happens, why is it important? For me, I think some of the most valuable education I had began with my parents. So, and I had two parents who loved poetry. So my dad's favorite poet was a woman called Miss Lou, a patois speaking, folklore storyteller, Jamaican poet and performer. And he used to record tapes of Miss Lou. Anytime she'll pop up, sometimes she'll pop up in the BBC World Service or some like pirate radio station. They'll just have a snippet of one of her poems. Another poet that they might put on there is Jean Binterbury's, Linton Kwesi Johnson, Benjamin Zephaniah, Mikey Smith. So there was all of this kind of wealth of cataloging in a way that my dad did, and he would record it on these tapes. And this is why I've got one of my dad's tapes tattooed on me here. So on this side of the tape, it was all of the poems that my dad used to record off the radio and off TV. And then on the other side of the tape, he would then give me the space for him to record my voice, trying to practice the poems, trying to recite the poems. So that on that tape, on the other side, it says Raymond speaking, and it's just him conversing with me. And so like, this is a very much kind of in the world of academia, in a kind of academic way, this could be modeled as culture capital and learning through culture capital. And now on my mom's side, my mom's favorite poet, there are two poets she would often talk about: William Blake, who doesn't know William Blake, and Adrian Mitchell. And I have quite a visceral memory when I was a kid, and this is before apartheid was fully lifted. So in the UK, we were still massively marching to end apartheid in South Africa. And so both my parents went down to Westminster Square, and they would have poets performing in the square. And one of the poets I remember seeing was a man called Adrian Mitchell. And Adrian Mitchell, his famous poem, one of his famous poems was Tell Me Lies About Vietnam. So I'm there on my dad's shoulders with my mom, and we're there involved in this protest to try and end apartheid and put pressure on the South African government to stop all of the racist regimes that were happening there. But again, I'd say that this experience is modeled through a idea of culture capital. I'm receiving the story of the moment and the times through a poem, through a performed poem. And so when we would walk back from these protests, my mom would also point out other places which were significant to other poets. So if we were, for example, walking across Westminster Bridge, she would say, do you know William Wordsworth wrote a poem about this bridge? Do you know T.S. Eliot wrote a poem about this bridge? Do you know Coleridge wrote a poem about this bridge? Do you know Blake had a poem about this bridge? Like a bridge built in 1740, I think it was built, between 1740 and 1760, becomes this almost like a meeting point in the landscape of our literature, of our canon. So this is where I'm thinking about how landmarks play a role in our education, but also in our storytelling, and how we understand our city, our surroundings, where we are. I'd just like to put up a picture of the plaques. I selected some plaques that are on view around the Camden Borough. So you can see here George Orwell, T.S. Eliot, Tagore, Paul Robeson, D.H. Lawrence, Dylan Thomas, Yeats, Virginia Woolf. Each of these names are huge, huge stories and huge bodies of work and really powerful, I'd say, culturally, powerfully and impactfully cultural capital, because within each of these people, I mean, for example, Paul Robeson and the whole story of Paul Robeson, if you know about him, being kicked out of America for being accused of being a communist and living in the borough of Camden, where he went on to act here and sing here. George Orwell, who most of us will know, very much a big part of our education here. And then I was imagining this as a kind of realized version of what my mom was doing. So there weren't these plaques. These plaques weren't around when my mom was doing what she did. You know, my mom just knew the stories. For example, we walked past this house once. I can't remember exactly where it was, but I think we were walking towards Peckham. And William Blake has a poem about the angels of Peckham Rye, and she would point at the trees and she'd say, William Blake saw an angel out by one of these trees. And just the things that did, the seeds that planted in me, because she was giving me stories. She was letting me into the stories, and she was allowing me to see the stories of these great poets, of these artists, of these writers, of these figures. She was telling me that these are my stories too, you know, that we can find our way into them. And I would say that one of the things that people often talk to me about in terms of poetry, in terms of becoming a poet and practicing poetry and really embracing my identity as a poet, it startles people because they often think, well, how does that happen? And you know, I mean, there might even be some English teachers on this call, so I want to be careful how I say it. But there's having gone into schools for the past 10 years and been a poet in residence in lots of different schools, in deaf schools, hearing schools, schools in Hackney, to schools in Athlone in South Africa. There's often a fear or a hesitancy around poetry. And for most people, I'd say, it seems that their first encounter with poetry is in a classroom with an English teacher, maybe trying to teach them iambic pentameter, the Shakespeare rhythm. And if that is your origin story for poetry, and that might really work for some people as a way in, but again, thinking about diversity of learning, for me, my way into poetry was the stories, was the music, was, you know, as well as the work, and was the landscape, the places, the sites. Another thing I would like to share or model, or maybe if there's some teachers or educators watching, is I just want to show these pictures of these writers, Sam Selvon, Dinah Evans, and Andrea Levy, 3 fiction writers who all have scenes in their novels set in King's Cross. So I was just thinking about that as well, and how we embed the kind of fictionalized lives of our people, of these characters, and how they end up in streets, in sites that are very real. And so these are just 3 examples of writers who you can read their books and you'll be able to find streets. I mean, and this is, of course, no one in the UK, probably no one did this more famously than Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens made such a massive impact on the cultural landscape of the UK, of London in particular, is that when you walk around Camden, Charles Dickens characters, fictionalized characters, have plaques. So there are like places with like there's a house around near me that literally says the name of one of Charles Dickens' characters lived here. And so that for me is interesting, and raises this idea of what a kind of literal relationship with a landscape is, and what a spiritual or imagined landscape is, and how we can bring that in to our learning. So I just want to go back to John LaRose as well, because I'm just trying to throw kind of just examples of people that have really inspired me, and people that both I feel inhabit their identities as creators, as writers, and as teachers. So just to talk a bit about why John LaRose inspired me. What John LaRose did in the late 70s, 80s, through the early 90s, he noticed a problem, particularly with Black youth going through the British education system. He looked at the books, he looked at the textbooks, he looked at the things that they were learning about the history, or about British history. And then he looked at what the British curriculum was teaching them about Black history. And in this definition of Black, I'm going to also throw in, I'm going to extend that to South Asian and almost any kind of anyone around that, even people from the Commonwealth as well as the former colonies. And so he, again, talking, because he's a poet, right? He understands the power of story, and he sees the stories that a lot of Black youth are being told about themselves and where they are from. And what he did is something very practical and brave of him. Him and his wife, whose name I did write down. I want to make sure I get his wife's name in as well. Sarah White. Him and Sarah White opened up their house to basically to young people of color. It was an open door for them to come into his house and take lessons. And John LaRose would sometimes have guests around as well. So like I said, some of his peers, some of other poets, other writers, and it would just be a conversation with them. And it might be one of the things that some teachers might know, some of the language. It could be like a democratic classroom, which is where it's not just the hierarchical order of a teacher, one teacher at the front who's just giving information for students to memorize. No, this is kind of active learning rather than passive learning. When we get to engage with the lives and the memories of the students, of the people that we're speaking with, and then we bring them into our cultural space, our classrooms, and we validate them, and we make that as much part of the curriculum and the learning experience as, say, reading Shakespeare or George Orwell. And I should also say that it was mentioned that I went to Goldsmiths and I did what was called a spoken word MA. But I feel like that word those words don't quite sum up what I did, because at Goldsmiths, I spent much more time learning about how learning happens and learning about something called emotional literacy. And so there are lots of kind of case studies that I did over the 3 years while I was at Goldsmiths, which I got to try. So everything I'm talking about now isn't kind of ideology. This is kind of tried practical work where we went in, well, me and a few other poets went into some schools, mainly around the places where we're from, where we're born. So I focus on schools in Hackney. And I went in as a poet, but also as I would call myself an emotional historian. And what that would mean is I would take an active interest in the lives of the young poets, of the students that I was meeting and working with, And I was allowing them to open up and tell me a bit about their lives at home, tell me a bit about what they know about their parents, even bringing in maybe other languages that they speak to their parents, which might be different to the language they speak to their teachers and their friends, and giving that a space. And one of the questions that I'd often ask at the end of these sessions, when students have kind of shared that or spoke about that and written about that, was who here has learned something new about someone in this room? And almost every time someone's hand goes up, and then that becomes another conversation about, okay, great, so how do we bring in this new knowledge and apply it to, again, to our education, to what we're learning? I know I'm like grazing the surface of all of this. I just wanted to kind of get as much of this as I could. So I guess what I'll do now is I'll come to this point I was thinking of, where practically, how do we connect these grassroots strategies to meaningfully to a more stable and cared for infrastructure? And I'm very, again, talking about John LaRose, I'm very much in tune with the community, being community minded. So I just want to share some places in the Camden Borough which have been intrinsic, really important sites for me, where learning has happened. So the Poetry Society, there's the Poetry Cafe. This is the first place where I ever performed, no, the second place where I ever performed a poem. And I was invited down there on a Tuesday, and I found out that there was a poetry open mic. And I went down there, and I was an 18-year-old with, I'd just come back from work experience. I'd lived in America for 7 months, working with deaf and hard of hearing young people. And I'd been writing furiously over the months in the notebooks. And what I found out about myself while I was over there was that I wanted to be a poet. So I came back and started finding places where I could share my work. So here, the Poetry Society on the right, Poetry Cafe, was very much a genesis for me beginning my story as a poet. Now, some of the poets that I met in that building would then invite me to the building that's on the left. Now, Conway Hall, I'm sure there are people here that understand the cultural richness and significance of Conway Hall. I don't think you could name someone who hasn't spoken at Conway Hall, from Desmond Tutu to Winnie Mandela, to James Berry and Andrew Sulky, Margaret Busby, Jessica and Eric Huntley, Michael Rosen, Darcus Howe, all the people that I mentioned earlier. Conway Hall has been a landmark for radical ideas. I wouldn't be, in fact, I was looking for it. I think James Baldwin also might have read there as well. So when I was invited into a place like Conway Hall, and because of the stories I'd known, because this was a place where my mum would have walked past and told me about the significance of that building and the history of it, I walked in immediately feeling like I was part of the story of a nation. I was part of the story of literature. I was a part of the story of the radical and important ideas of this country. It's a powerful thing. It's a powerful thing, just aligning your thinking with that. I think there were some other buildings as well. There's a slide, yeah. So not far from Conway Hall on the left, you'll see Housemans, a radical bookshop. This would be the place where I first read books by Audre Lorde, the place where I would pick up pamphlets. I picked up C.L.R. James. I mean, so many. So just having a space like this, and again, remember, I'm from Hackney, so I'm coming out of Hackney. I'm leaving my ends for this, right? And again, the reason I know about this mainly because of my mom. My mom would also be going there looking for books. I'd find some of her books sometimes. I say, where do you get this? It says, oh, Housemans, go check it out. It's also, they also have a secondhand section downstairs where every book is £1. And then on the right, you've got the Quakers Cafe, a free public space which I've used over the years to meet friends, to meet other poets. I've been invited to do a talk once in this building. And again, when we think about the history and the significance of the Quakers and what we learned from them, yeah, really important, impactful, safe as well space for a lot of people, I'd say. And I think there's another building in Camden I want to shout out, the British Library. So the British Library, I mean, I think we all would have something to say about British Library as students, but again, British Library has been a place for me to write, to connect with other people, and their lending library has been amazing. And you know, it's not a place that we can also enter these spaces, understand them as institutions, and engage with them critically. You know, I'm not trying to kind of glorify anything about these spaces. I'm just in a way claiming them as important spaces that are part of my story as a poet, as a learner, as a teacher. So I think that I will leave it there. I know I've skimmed a lot of ground, but I know that we're going to do a Q&A now, I think, with that. So I hope, give thanks again to John LaRose. I hope some of this has provided some inspiration for you. Yeah. Well, welcome to poetry.
Fantastic. Thanks, Raymond. That was a great sort of whistle-stop tour of the Knowledge Quarter according to Raymond Antrobus. That was absolutely fantastic. You said you were a Hackney boy, but I know you're no longer a Hackney boy. You are now a Camden boy. You are, in fact, stone's throw from the British Library. I won't say what road you're on, but literally, I could, you know. So listen, what's it like now being in the area that you visited so many times, these places, these institutions? Conway Hall, which is also part of the Knowledge Quarter, British Library is part of the Knowledge Quarter. You know, how does it feel now to be in the heart of this area, and what does that mean for you?
And I think that's what I was trying to convey in that talk. Like it almost feels like coming home in this way, because I feel like my memories of some of these spaces and the people that are kind of associated with them, including all of the names that I just mentioned in that talk, had a presence here. So when I'm able to, again, to align some of my thinking and some of my ideas with people who lived in the same roads, you know, just found the corners, you know, I pass the plaque almost every day that George Orwell lived here, T.S. Eliot. And again, these aren't people who I'm trying to kind of glorify and say that they didn't have things that we can criticize, but it is for me just a kind of I don't know, I don't want to say homecoming, but a kind of invitation into their world, into their work, and I can walk the streets with them, you know.
Who are the unsung heroes of the area, Raymond? Whose blue plaques haven't you seen yet that you think deserve to be there?
Well, it's tricky because I know it's a Camden Borough, so I know a lot of for example, I would have liked to have seen more from John LaRose, but actually John LaRose lived in Islington. The same with Andrew Sulkey, who would have had a big presence in Camden. I'd have to look at that properly, but like, there's just so many names. I'd say that James Berry was the first Black poet to anthologize Black British writing. And he is, for me, as a poet, speaking as a poet, a name who doesn't get his due, considering so much kind of so many things that have grown from his legacy and his contribution to the British literary landscape. I think it needs to be turned up louder.
Yeah. If you were to put your John Le Roy's hat on, Raymond, whose stories aren't being heard, and who would you open your door to let them into your living room?
If I was to put my John Le Roy's hat on, whose stories aren't being heard, and whose door would I open, or who? Is that again? Sorry, who?
And you know the way that John Le Roy and his wife opened their doors to people to come in.
Yeah.
What are the types of groups, organizations, or the groups of people in the local community that you feel their stories haven't been heard yet?
That's a lot. We would need more than a house. We would need a temple, you know. But I think that someone or a group who I would like to see more presence from are people from the deaf and hard of hearing community. It's only been since 2003 since British Sign Language has been recognized as an official English language, even though it's been called British Sign Language for its 400-year history. And I would like to see more people that have come out of SEN, Special Educational Needs Unit. So I came out of a Special Educational Needs Unit. I was assumed to be dyslexic with all kinds of learning difficulties. And then they found out that I was basically deaf. And so I got hearing aids. I mean, I was given loads of support. In fact, one thing that's quite amazing about being back here in Camden is Bart's Hospital and St. Joseph. There's a hospital which was one of the first hospitals I went to when I was around 6 years old, and had tests basically to figure out whether my deafness was inherited or something had brought it on.
Yeah.
And, so I think that I just watched the film The Reason I Jump. Is out now. I recommend anyone to go and watch that film. It's a beautiful and complicated film about autism, but something that can be applied universally. Again, thinking about diversity of learning in particular is, autism or deafness or dyslexia. These things are we just have to know more about learning styles, about the different people's ways of being. So my learning style, again, it was a complete accident. Like my mom and my dad, like just telling me these stories, standing me on Parliament Square and being able to talk about the significance of, not just the other people that had stood on that square, but also talk about, politics and the significance of Cromwell, Cromwell's facing the Parliament and Churchill. You know what I mean? So all of these are like stories in stone. So I guess the other question that brings up is, our teachers, are our teachers equipped with these stories? Because I never got any of this from my institutional British education. I got it at home, and that's where I think my real wealth is, and my real knowledge came from.
Absolutely. We're running slightly over, but there's a question that's come from one of the audience members saying, how can we get young people engaged with poetry from a young age rather than through mandatory study in secondary school? So I'm sure you could talk about that for half an hour, but just a very quick response to that, Raymond.
So, I mean, like I said, don't just talk about the work, talk about the lives that they have lived. My dad was very adamant in saying that Bob Marley was a poet, and the way that Bob Marley could be spoken about, not just as a musician and a storyteller, but also as a poet. So we would listen to the songs, and then he'd be talking to me about the lyrics. And then my mom would be talking about a William Blake poem, London by William Blake. And then she would say, what's the difference between Bob Marley Redemption Song and William Blake's London. What's the difference? And actually, there was so many parallels in terms of, in terms of engaging with the history, with people engaging with struggle, engaging with repression, engaging with poverty. There's this is what I'm saying. Like, we are literally living on, I think, one of the richest cultural heritage sites, like places, not just being in Camden, but being in London. If we can just sync up our understandings and our stories with the literature, with our lesson plans, I think that there's a lot more open, a lot more other ways in to talk about poetry and art and people.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, look, thanks so much for that, Raymond.